I want to tell you just a little bit about Sharity. My name is Carol Wick, and I am the president of the organization. We are an international consulting firm that works in 33 countries across the globe, helping nonprofits who are wanting to grow, scale their operations. And we do that through deliberately helping them do business planning, budgeting, building their team, their board of directors, and eventually pulling all that together and creating a fundraising strategy to fund the plan. So if you're interested in scaling your organization, feel free to reach out to us. We have lots of great resources on our website, and an amazing team that can help you with everything from working with that business plan to helping clean up your database. Donor databases are our big pain point. We've got an expert in just about anything you can imagine on our team. So we're excited to provide this series to our community because we work with so many amazing organizations that are doing great work. But we really wanted to have an opportunity to do some thought leadership and not just talk about what we do, but what you all do. Just a little bit about some of our services. I mentioned campaign readiness, fundraising, communication, but we also do a lot of impact and return on investment work. I just really want to quickly mention this is the third part series for the fall. Coming up for 2025, we are going to have a new series. We're really excited about this. It's called Lead with Strength, Purpose, and Sustainability. We're really going to be tapping the toughest issues that nonprofits deal with. Specifically, we're going to be having panelists come in and talk about succession planning. Whether you are a longtime CEO, a founder of an organization, how do you actually make that succession leap work well? How do you start to think about longtime employees and how do we transition from someone who's been in an organization for 10, 15, 20 years and make that transition in a healthy, successful way? And how do you, on the other end of that, as the new CEO come in, deal with the fact that you're taking over from a founder or a longtime, very popular CEO? Also, how do you balance your own personal health? We're discovering that we have a lot of CEOs that we work with, senior leadership, who are experiencing catastrophic health issues. So how do you balance your own personal health and well-being with the demands of being a nonprofit leader? And finally, balancing that board relationship. That is always one of the struggles that nonprofit leaders have to deal with is how do we balance all of this? How do I balance leading my organization and being the CEO I need to be, but also working with a board of directors that is not too powerful and yet also is not just a check the box group. So it's a delicate balance that we have to do in nonprofit leadership. So join us in 2025. We will have the website to sign up for this up momentarily within the next few days. But in the meantime, if you sign up for our newsletter, you will we'll announce the series sign up. You only have to sign up for one of them, and you get signed up for all three. So we hope you'll join us in 2025. And with that, I'm really excited to turn this over to Ann Miskey, who is one of our amazing experts at Sharity, who is going to be leading our panel discussion today. Ann.
Thank you so much, Carol. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you today to talk about this very important subject. So our webinar today is about myth-busting homelessness, how fallacies prevent homelessness from being addressed. For all of you who work in this field, you know that myths abound, but what we may not think about is how those very myths keep us from solving this issue. Homelessness is one of the major issues of our time, and sadly, it's growing all over the country, in fact, all over the Western world. So today, I am very excited that we have three amazing experts with us here today who are going to talk about this issue from having worked in the field and having worked in communities. So talking not only about the myths, but what actually does work to end homelessness. Now, I'm going to give very brief bios. Their bios are on the website, but I'd rather spend more time talking, but I'll give a brief bio on each of these people. In no particular order, we have Sean Morrissey, who is the Vice President of Advocacy and Community Engagement at Union Station Homeless Services in Los Angeles County. Sean brings extensive knowledge of the issues as well as practical experience around things such as a service provision, justice-centered change with a focus on mental health and substance use disorders. He is dedicated to amplifying the voices of folks with lived experience and frontline staff to impact and inform best practice service models. John DeCarmen serves as the Chief Executive Officer for GRACE, a low-barrier emergency shelter and one-stop assistance center that has moved more than 3,100 people into permanent housing, reducing local homelessness by 47% and unsheltered homelessness by 53% in Gainesville, Florida. And then last but certainly not least, we have Mike Kinman. Now, Mike hasn't worked directly in homeless services, but he is a champion for marginalized voices, for justice, and understands about community. And he's going to be sharing with us today an initiative that his congregation took, that he and his congregation took, that has had a major effect on, positive effect on homelessness in the Pasadena area of Southern California. So welcome, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us today. Now, with no more on from me, let's get right into it. And I'm going to address this actually to John and to Sean. And can you talk a little bit about what are some of those myths that we hear all the time about homelessness and sort of your perspective on those myths? John, I'm going to throw you in first.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for this opportunity to be here today. I would say, in general, most communities get more wrong about people without housing at this point than they get right. You know, there is so much fear around. There's so much fear around poverty. There's so much fear around people who are different than us. There's so much fear around what do we do if more people need help than we can help? And it kind of leads to these sorting exercises where we intentionally or unintentionally let the conversation and the narrative start to sort people into who's deserving of help, who's not deserving of help. In the homeless sector, who's worthy of housing, who's not worthy of housing. And it's not just what we're reading in the newspaper. It's not just what we're reading online. It's as much baked into the way providers often deliver services to people. And I wanted to start today. One of the things for me that was the absolute just game-changing in my understanding of homelessness is an article by Peter Marcuse way back in the 80s called Neutralizing Homelessness. And this is when homelessness had sort of first started to appear on the scene. And we weren't quite sure what it was going to look like or anything. We just knew that there were more and more people coming out on the street. And he writes that homelessness is shocking to those who are not homeless because it exposes misery in the midst of plenty and represents alienation from home in a home-based society. And he goes on to say, and I'm not going to tip my cards on politics too much here, but he says to look at homelessness as something that can be solved by the government or is a problem of the government would require the acknowledgement of the failure of the market to solve the housing problem and to provide housing for everybody who needs it. So with that, you know, we ended up in a situation where we are looking around on the street and we're seeing all these people and we're being brought up and raised to think that we are in the greatest country and the richest country in the world. And we take care of people who work hard. And if you work hard, you succeed. And if you succeed, you own the home and all these different things. And we couldn't acknowledge that that wasn't working. So instead, what we did is all of the government programs for years and years and years that directed any resources towards homeless services were things like substance abuse and mental health. So most funding initially came through substance abuse and mental health services. Those are problems with individuals. Those do not talk of or address at all the systemic problems. Those say, what's wrong with the person and how can we fix them? And I think that from the very beginning has created and sort of set the course where we automatically assume that there's something wrong with somebody if they're in abject poverty. There's something wrong with somebody if they're coming to us and saying, I'm not sure what to do, I need your help, or there's something dangerous about them. So I think that has colored so much of the local and the national conversation. And it's not just about what people think about it. It's also what providers think about it. If homeless service providers were not afraid of the people they served, they probably wouldn't require a police clearance before they allowed somebody in. If homeless service providers were not afraid of the people that they served, they probably would not be so worried about, giving services to people who don't deserve them or are trying to get more than is due to them. And so there are so many different things that show up. And I think most of it is because it's so easy we even me, as I'm the executive director of a homeless shelter, have been in this industry for decades now. And I'll tell you, there are times where I can be driving home from work or let's say I was going to go have a beer at the end of my workday. Well, I could be driving to that bar to go have a beer, and I can pass by a guy sitting on the bench who just got off of work at a day labor place. He's worked 10, 12 hours of really, really difficult work, and he's having a beer at the bus stop. But there's something, even though I'm on my way to have a beer after work, I can be driving right past and say, look at that guy having a beer at the bus stop. No wonder he's homeless. And we can sort of fall into these justifications that make it easy. And I get it, because it's hard, and there are so many people who need help these days that it can feel overwhelming. And so there's some elements of this that are somewhat natural, but all of it to me really boils down to the fact that, I can go have a beer in a bar. Somebody else is going to have a beer on a bus stop. If I get into a disagreement with my wife, I can close a bedroom door and we can have that conversation behind a closed door. I don't have to do that in a park. And when we think about all of the myths around homelessness, to me, the biggest driving factor is that homeless people are forced to live their private lives in public spaces. So the things that impact people without housing are not radically different from the things that are happening in the housed community. The difference is we can see what's happening in the homeless community. We can't necessarily see what's happening in the housed community.
Thank you so much, John. Sean, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would double down on that idea that we pathologize homelessness. We look at the presenting or most obvious feature, and we hone in on that as the cause of that individual's misery. And that really betrays the complexity of the entire situation. And more than that, I think when we're focused on that, we're not focused on the broken systems, structures, racist laws, practices that are creating these pathologies that we're looking at. We're hyper-focused on the individual experiencing the problem as if they created the problem. And I love that phrasing around being forced to live outside, because that's what I call it too. People are being forced to live outside as opposed to those of us who are allowed to live inside.
Yeah, I thank you both. Totally agree. And, no matter what community I've been in, and I did a lot of traveling around this issue around the country, I heard the same things, the same tropes. Number one, every community will tell you that the homeless people there don't come from there. They've come to whatever community you live in we have good services, build it and they will come. The weather, we used to get this in California all the time. They've all come for the weather. And that's another myth that allows people to say they're not our people, so we shouldn't be forced to help them. They're from somewhere else. But everyone in every community is all from somewhere else when we know that's not the truth. So I think if you ask most people right now in our country, what are the major causes of homelessness? And you said it, John, addiction and mental health. And so what we're starting to see, again, and not to say that there aren't people who suffer both of those things living on the streets, there are more people in houses that suffer from those things, right? It's the living outside, but also the fact that homelessness in itself is such a traumatic event that it can cause problems that may show like severe mental illness, or people will turn to drugs as a way to deal with life on the streets. But I think the biggest issue we're facing right now is we are seeing a shift back to old models of intervention around homelessness, where we focused on the fault of the individual and forced treatment, and then came housing first, which was, no, what we need to do as a society, if you have a home, you're no longer homeless. Simple as that. But now we're seeing a shift. I don't know, would either of you like to talk about what you're seeing in the big world around this shift coming from a lot of frustration, anger, and views of people who experience homelessness? Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I think we like to punish people in this country, to be perfectly frank, and we that resonates, and we appreciate that, and we always believe that people are the manufacturers of their own misery, and oftentimes that needs to be punished. And when you look at substance use, again, who's doing all the drugs? It's not homeless people, it's white middle-aged homeowners. That's who's really doing all the drugs. If you want to, and to speak to that issue of drug use, that goes back. Drug prohibition and drug control goes back, over 100 years, and is closely associated to the color of the skin of the people who are using those substances. Right, the two most deadly drugs out there are tobacco and alcohol. Kill way more people than all of the illicit drugs combined, and yet we punish groups of people for using those drugs that we chose as more dangerous, when in fact they're absolutely not more dangerous. And I mean, not to go off on a tangent, but our drug war is the mechanism by which we accomplish mass incarceration in this country. And you have to have bodies to fill prisons to make money, and we make sure that bodies are filling prisons. Most of them are brown and black bodies, and most of those are non-violent, low-level drug offenders. Nowhere in human history has anyone incarcerated this level, this number of people as we do in the United States, and it's a boon. It's a profit-making system.
Yeah.
And I would say the way I have seen it shift, starting at the local level, it has gone both ways. I want to be really clear about that, and I'll start with the sort of the positive, negative one, and that is, when I was asked to go speak to a business maybe 10, 15 years ago, I would inevitably get to that business and the owner would pull me aside and say, hey, listen, we really asked you to be here because there's a guy who's been sleeping in our doorway. We're not really sure what to do about it, and we were hoping you could give us some guidance on that. Today, when I am being asked to go speak at businesses around homelessness, I generally get pulled to the side and they're saying, hey, listen, I actually asked you to be here because our receptionist actually just had to move 40 miles out of town because she couldn't afford to live here. And the guy who drives the truck has lost his house, and we're letting him stay in the truck right now, and we're not sure what to do. And so to some extent, as things get more tenuous for more people, I think homelessness is getting closer to home for a lot of people. But the reaction to that has been, I think, an even more aggressive narrative that tries to put the blame back on people. So for what that might look like, I mean, we could look at it at the local level where cops might be harassing people for sleeping outside, but I think it makes the most sense to start looking at it at the state level, in states like mine in Florida, where we've just passed House Bill 1365 that makes it illegal to sleep outside. And if a local government doesn't arrest somebody, then the person who made that call can sue the local government. We've also seen it carry into Grants Pass versus Oregon, which has again made it illegal to be poor in our entire country, where there is now the right to arrest people for the simple life-sustaining act of sleeping or breathing, or, if you're sleeping outside, if you're peeing outside, if you're drinking outside, none of those are illegal if you do them in your own home. So we're actually kind of creating what the problem is and then using it, as Sean said, to find a way to just punish people and move it out of sight if we can.
Yeah.
And you
could I jump in just for a second?
Yes, please, Mike.
Yeah, no, and I love this, and part of this, I put a note in the chat when Sean, you started talking about incarceration, saying that's not a tangent at all. This is the same systemic approach, and John, that's why I'm so glad you brought policing into this. And what I'm finding is that we're doubling down, and this happens in societies in times of great tumult and fear. Is we double down on a retributive justice system where it's like we're afraid things are changing. Let's find and correct and punish those who are not doing well. And there's actually some really great work that's being done on moving from retributive justice to restorative justice. There's a book I'm reading now by Anne Russo that really talks about organizations that are adopting community accountability and transformative justice approaches. And before I get too jargony with that, what we're finding it boils down to is reframing in just really some very simple ways. One of them you've probably heard before, which is going from asking the question, what's wrong with you, to the question, what happened to you? One presumes there is something wrong. What's going on? Why, you are not right. The other invites us into understanding of circumstances and mutuality. The other, which I love, is a sense of moving from justice as getting even to justice as getting well. And those are two very different things. And so when we say, how do we as a society get well with everything that we know about trauma healing, our answers are very different than how do we balance the scales when we feel someone has wounded us. And so I just think, those are two ways that I just keep asking myself. It's like, okay, how can I not ask what's wrong with you? How can I ask what happened to you? How can I not worry about getting even? How can I be saying, how do we get well together?
Yeah, I think that these are so important. And the flip side, where it is more of a punitive, we blame the victim. What people don't understand, because we've been trying this since, the 1980s, and it actually makes the problem worse.
Well,
You've got someone who is arrested because they're sleeping or, on the street, and the next thing they know, they're sent to jail. Now they have a record, so they can't. So it just escalates everything. And I know there was a question about now with this new law in Florida, and I would not be surprised if we see more and more of this nationally under the new administration that's coming in, because they take a punitive approach to everything, that it actually spirals down and the problem gets worse and worse and worse because you're going after this. The interesting thing is it was Ronald Reagan in the 1980s who was the first person to term the saying the deserving poor. And so I find that a lot in the work we do. There are those people who, oh, poor you, we want to help you, and you did it to yourself. And we differentiate when all people are victims of systems. I used to say of systems that don't work, but they actually work in exactly the way they're meant to work.
Yeah.
These are, as Sean kind of mentioned, racist, discriminatory, all of these things. So now I'm going to flip a little bit and have a little bit more of a positive view. And that is, so what does work? And I'm going to ask Sean and John to speak a little bit about, and short, about what works in terms of the homeless service world, some of the very specific interventions, things that we do. But really what I'd like to spend time on is how community can make a difference. So John and Sean, if either of you want to jump in and talk a little bit about the methods that really do work. John, you said you've reduced homelessness by, 46%.
Yeah,
So what made a difference?
So when we train everybody at our shelter, and we are the kind of the biggest game in town, there's 100 and maybe 200 beds total for single adults in our community. We provide 184 of them. We train all of our people, and I want to give Mike a shout out. Mike just used the exact phrase that defines trauma-informed care. What we do that works really well is not radical. It is, we are kind to people. We recognize that homelessness is defined by a lack of a home, and therefore can only be solved by the provision of a home, and that everybody deserves housing. There's no, you deserve it because you tried harder, or we build in a lot of understanding around, like, people are showing up to us in the midst of the worst crisis of their life, and they're showing up after having made generally a lifetime of the best bad choices available to them. They're not always going to remember to say please and thank you. They're not always going to remember to whatever shows up, there is part of the issue. It's not that we have to figure out, like, okay, you must want housing and you don't. And even that comes from service providers not doing things in the correct way. We also train people on the notion that there is no such thing as a service-resistant person. That is something that, as we get more punitive, as resources tighten, we have to kind of cast some as others who don't want help. And it's not that they don't want help; it's that generally the help that we're offering sucks. It's not designed for what they needed. It's not created with them in mind. It generally has some semblance of just white middle class ideals that are based around, if you really wanted to improve your life, you'd be in college. Or if you really wanted to improve your life, then you would be doing this or this. And it doesn't give people the opportunity, and everybody at every level deserves the opportunity to have some agency in their life. You lose that as you have less resources available to you, but that doesn't mean that it's our role as providers to take it away from you. So what we have done and what I have seen, I work with shelters around the country. The ones that work really well are the ones that take people as they are, that recognize that it is the role of shelter staff need to change what they are doing if it's not working for the people that they serve. You don't just stand around with your arms crossed demanding that the people you're trying to serve change what they're doing to meet your needs. So if anything is working to sum it all up, it's that it works well when we fit our programs and we force our programs and our services to fit the needs of the people we're serving, and we don't try to force the people we're serving to fit the needs of our programs and services.
Great. Thank you, John. Sean, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with all of that, what everybody's saying. After 40 years of failed practices, we finally landed on some best practice models: trauma-informed care, harm reduction, housing first, which are also highly relational models, which speak to that idea of community. I mean, I call those love models, even though there's lots of therapeutic interventions and practice within those models. These models really are about sitting one-on-one with someone, coming into authentic relationship and community with them, helping them be seen as the full human beings that they are, not just the sum of presenting pathology, and helping them gain purpose and meaning, to become helpers, not just people who are helped. And the only way that happens is in community. Housing heals, but housing in and of itself isn't the solution. You can stick someone in a house and stick me in a house, and I will be just as sick and have the same issues as I had when I was living on the street. You have to, that's just the start. You have to have community, meaning and purpose in your lives. That's what heals, I have to feel that I have value and that there's some reason for me to be here for me to get better.
Thank you. And that is a perfect segue into the next section, where we're talking about what is the role of community. A lot of the backlash we see happening is when community members really do want to help, they do want to support. Maybe they give money, maybe they serve meals, but they see the problem continuing to grow. And I've talked to a lot of people saying, I want to help, but I'm just fed up with the encampments down the street. The numbers are growing. And then what you see with this frustration about, I don't know what to do, what can we do? Then you get a movement back to what we're talking about, criminalization, victimizing the victims. But so this is one of my favorite stories, true stories that happened. And I am going to invite Mike to talk about the situation and how it progressed and what a community, in this case, it was a faith community, did to really look at how do we make a true difference in our community. So Mike, over to you.
Yeah, and so like just a few things before I tell the story, and stories are all sort of like, that's the best part, right? Is first of all, also recognizing there's a certain amount of preaching to the converted that's happening here. If you're on this call, you probably know a lot of this stuff already. And so a couple things that are just sort of operating principles that I've used and that we used as we tell the story of Safe Haven is, first of all, we're never going to end homelessness by trying to end homelessness. And it's because we're never going to care enough. As long as it is a faceless issue that affects others, we're not going to. We're going to do it when we build relationship with people to the point where not only can we not sleep at night knowing that they're on the street, but that we have such joy from the relationship that like we get to help them, to all of us being a community that's housed. And so, part of just a shift I made. So I was a congregational pastor. And one of the shifts I made is in our prayers on Sunday, we would pray for, the homeless. And I would say, well, let's just change that to those among us who are, without homes, or those among us who are homeless. And every language we would sort of say, I always, it got to be almost a joke about how I would say those among us, because what that says is we're all part of the same community. And I'm so glad that you mentioned resistance. And, whenever you try to do something new, and most of us, that's the other thing is most people want to do good. Most people are just holding on in their own lives. And they have enough to deal with their own homes and their own families. And it's just huge to think, what can I do on top of this? And a mistake that we make often, and I'm sure I've been a part of this, is when people are resistant to doing things to help those among us who are struggling with homelessness. We can really easily respond with shame. We call them NIMBYs. We just instead of saying, what, resistance is actually a part of the process of change. Because if someone is resisting something, they're actually facing it maybe for the first time. And I can think of a million things that the first time I faced it or the first time it got hard, I was resistant to. And where I kept moving forward is when someone stayed with me in love and didn't shame me for that initial act of resistance. So part of what I've learned to do, and I'm still learning to do it, is no matter what the issue is to say there's going to be resistance. Resistance doesn't help you identify the bad people, because I don't really believe in bad people. I believe that we act in various ways. Resistance helps us identify, here are the people who actually are engaged enough that they're pushing back. And how can I work with them? What I don't want is apathy. If someone cares enough to say, no, I'm resisting to this, it's okay, we're engaged. We can do something with that. So another piece of this is there's a joy to it. And I will say the very beginning of this program, and I'll try to speak briefly about this, which is really hard for me, is, when I first got to All Saints, apathy is a revolution ender, amen. When I first got to All Saints in Pasadena, they put me up in this giant 5-bedroom house that the church owns, not really Jesus-y at all. And I was here alone in this house at night. My family still hadn't moved from St. Louis. And I'd gotten to know a man named Bob, who was sleeping on our church campus, and he was helping out and and doing various things. And he was literally sleeping in sort of a Ramada in my parking space. And I remember one night it was raining, and all I can think of is I'm in my nice bed and Bob is there. And it wasn't feeling guilty. It was this is my friend. And so we realized, we've got this room, we can key it differently, we can do different things, and we can have him find a place to stay until he finds, something else. And it began with realizing this is a part of our community. He ushered on Sundays. He would help out. He would do various things. And the truth is there are people that we allow to be homeless, and there's people that we don't allow to be homeless. And I've found that most of it is about that phrase, among us. When we see people, as among us, we don't allow them to be homeless because they're part of us if we have the opportunity to do that. So the question is, how do we get people to be seen as among us? So I was in a community that had done a lot of really amazing work, founded the organization that Ann used to run, that Sean works for, Union Station Homeless Services, but tended to have more of a place of like, okay, we'll give money or we'll go serve a meal or we'll do these things, but it really was not relational and it wasn't building that. Now, our church was located right across the street from City Hall. And City Hall as civic space is a place that I believe everyone should be able to go to 24/7. The city saw it differently. They hired a security firm to basically at 10 o'clock every night kick everyone off of City Hall campus, which is basically, everyone among us who was struggling and had no place to live. And so many of them would come across the street and be sleeping at All Saints. And so, we had sort of a brief conversation. And what I said is, this is a great opportunity. What we didn't want was some people were trying to sleep near high voltage HVAC equipment, which was not safe at all. But it was, for them, it was safer, especially for women, because most women who are experiencing homelessness almost all of them have experienced sexual assault of one kind or another. And for many, it's an ongoing piece. So we said, well, let's actually just hire the same security folks, not to chase people off our campus, but to direct them to, these are some designated places that it's safe to sleep, make sure they're safe, and then also make sure in the morning they can move on their way. And to say, let's create an opportunity here for them to have a safe place to sleep. Well, then COVID happened. And, we'd had the security person coming at sort of 6 a.m. saying, okay, now it's time to move on. And the security company called me and said, I remember when Gavin Newsom gave the stay-at-home order and said, do you want us to come at 6 o'clock and move people off campus? And I said, well, no, there's not going to be anyone here. Let them stay. And it actually, as it turned out, we had a big banner out in front of the church at the time that said, All Saints Church welcomes all refugees. And we're in a civic center area. So during COVID, it turned into a ghost town. It wasn't a residential area. It wasn't even a business area where there was activated space. The whole neighborhood became completely unactivated space, which is, if you are struggling with homelessness, you want unactivated space because no one's going to hassle you. If you are in any kind of activated space, you're just going to get hassled. And so word got out that All Saints Church was really a safe haven for, those among us who are experiencing homelessness to go. And I'd had experience working in a downtown church in St. Louis for 10 years where, a good portion of our congregation were experiencing homelessness. They either lived at a shelter 2 blocks away or some of them slept on the steps of the cathedral. And, we actually had something we called the Cathedral Housing Project, where we would, it was a housing first model, and we would guarantee people rent and utilities for a full year. And we'd find an apartment, do that. We'd get job training. We get, and it is still going 10 years later. And it was just sort of a great way that people got on their feet. But the biggest piece of it was not in a proselytizing way. We don't care what your faith is. You're a human being. But we would be a community that would know your name, would care about you, would continue to check in with you. Because one of the things we learned was one of the biggest preventatives from people go in and out of homelessness all the time. You all know this. And the biggest thing that will prevent people from falling into homelessness is community. Because if we have community, if I have community, I have community. If something really starts to go wrong in my life and I'm in trouble, I have community that knows that and is checking in on me. It's like, oh, Mike, how can we help? And if I'm like, oh, I won't be able to pay my rent. Oh, how can I help you? Oh, hey, here's a couch. Here's, what can we do? And so we started having all these folks come to All Saints campus. At one point, and it was close to 50 or 60 people. And the parishioners started getting worried. And there was, a lot of the fear came up. And I think a lot of it was people grieving that they couldn't go to their church, and they'd be seeing, sort of driving by and seeing these people, and people are, it's the usual things people are worried about is like, oh, is there criminal activity, is there drug abuse, is there stuff like that? And I'm just, and my attitude towards that was let's have let the answer to everything, and this is going to hear from me, the answer to everything is community. And so what we explained to people from the congregation was, actually, this is keeping, people were like, oh, the building is going to get damaged. I said, actually, this is keeping the building safe. Because when you invite people into your space and say, this is not just our space, this is our space, as human beings, we just say, okay, let's care for this. And what we found is the people who were living on campus helped keep the campus clean. We realized right away, people was like, oh, well, people are urinating and defecating. I'm like, well, people generally don't like doing that outdoors. So we just rented a porta potty. And it's like, guess what? People stopped doing that, and they started using that. People, if there were people who, for whatever reason, were getting violent or doing whatever, the community policed itself in a really beautiful way. They identified their own leaders. There were times where I just sort of like, okay, here's a mop, a bucket, some bleach, go to town. And they had like a community, they had jobs assigned. It was really pretty amazing. Well, we got into sort of, after this had happened a couple of months, the neighbors actually were really good, but they started saying, look, this is not sustainable. So, reached out to Anne and Sean at Union Station. And basically what they asked was a really great question, which is, what would be a sustainable number of people who could stay on your campus overnight? And what we basically said is, well, before COVID happened, we were probably averaging 10 to 12. So let's say 12. And what Sean and Anne designed, and I didn't do any of this stuff. Sean and Anne did this. It was amazing. They designed this program called Safe Haven Bridge to Housing. And what we wanted it to be was something that was impactful and portable. And so what we wanted it to be is a way that a faith community, or really any kind of community, could help people, those among us who are struggling with homelessness, get into housing and stay there. And so the nuts and bolts of it that was designed were, okay, well, we have 12 people who will be on campus. We have a process for identifying them. They need to be at the stage where they are ready right now to be looking to go into housing. Some people aren't there yet. Again, remember, resistance is a part of the process of change. And to, have basically sort of a list of, these are sort of community norms and behaviors. And we were really sort of like what we sort of said about the norms and behaviors are, they need to be the same rules that apply to the rest of the church community. We're not going to have two tiers. And so, when people would say, well, you can't use drugs on campus, I'm like, okay, but that also means that I can't use drugs on campus, and that you can't use drugs on campus. And so, so like our rule is, if you need to use, and there's lots of people who need to use, please go off campus to use. And a big piece of that is sometimes where there's people are using, there also can be guns, and we're a gun-free campus. But to say, what, there's all sorts of drug users in our congregation, and we don't tell them they can't come to church. And so we just don't want them necessarily using on campus. So that's a rule for everybody. And we came up with community rules. And then Sean and Anne helped us go to the city and get funding for what's called a housing navigator. And it was someone who's employed by Union Station and would work with folks to help get them into housing. But in the meantime, and they all have sort of IDs. Hey, this is my name, and I'm part of the Safe Haven community. But they're around all the time. We got a grant from Pasadena Community Foundation, got some bike lockers and 12 of those. So people could, they'd camp out at night. In the morning, they put all their possessions away in the bike lockers where they're safe. We started eventually having folks from LA County, public health services come. We would have, every Monday we'd have food. Now they're looking at basically sort of looking at safe parking, doing sort of all these things that are happening. But the basic piece of this is when people were part of the Safe Haven program, we know that they're part of the community. We knew their names. They knew our names. And to this point, I believe we're actually more than 40 people have moved into housing, and none of them have dropped out because they're part of a community. It doesn't mean they have to go to church. but it means that we're known to each other. Brian Stevenson talks about the importance of proximity. And what that means is that as we get to know each other and we build relationships with each other, we begin to care about each other, and all those myths that we've talked about start falling away. So I know that was like longer than it probably needed to be. And so I'll just sort of leave it for there because I could talk about this forever.
No, thank you, Mike. And I think, you talk about that community, and talking to some of the folks who were on the campus as we got to know them, shared how that acceptance had changed their lives. They didn't talk about the services and all of that. It was about having another human being look at them and know their name and acknowledge them as a human being. But what was even, to me, that didn't surprise me.
Yeah.
But what surprised me is talking to some of the parishioners who weren't experiencing homelessness, who then knew the names and the life stories and would talk about them as a friend, not as one of those people. So it transformed not only those experiencing homelessness, but the community in real ways, because now it wasn't a them and us, as you said earlier. It's us. It's us. And I think that's amazing. Sean.
Just one thing really quick,
Yes.
just to come up on that, and then I'll be quiet, which is what it does is when we think about, and people of faith, sometimes we're the worst about this. When we think about things like ending homelessness, we sort of think of like, oh, that's one more thing if I was the good person I should do. And it becomes a chore. And what this then becomes is like, no, this is a get to. I get to be a part of helping this person that I have gotten to know and appreciate. I get to be a part of helping them in their life. And that's where the joy is. And so the whole process becomes fueled by joy instead of fueled by guilt.
Yeah, absolutely. Sean, did you want to add anything to this? Because I know you were very involved in sort of creating the program.
I don't think so. I enjoyed listening to it again. Even though I was there, I was like, that's a good story. It was like, you rocked it, John.
In my work, because I worked internationally, nationally, and locally around the issue of homelessness, and I'd go into communities and people would always say, so what is it going to take? What is that thing that's going to end homelessness? And I can talk to you about housing, and I can talk to you about services and policies and all of that. But what I would say to people is we will end homelessness when every single person recognizes the humanity in everyone else.
Uh-huh.
You don't let these things happen to other human beings. So that welcoming into community is something that all of us can do. We need people who have experience in, clinical, because they're working with people who have been highly traumatized. We need job experts, all of those things. But community can solve this by recognizing, again, that humanity in other people. Now, is there anything else? I want to throw it to the panelists. If there's anything else around this issue that you would like to share.
I'll just say sort of the other thing is like there's such abundance that we don't even think about. And like one of the people in the Safe Haven program, it turns out he was like really good barber and would cut hair. And so on Sunday mornings when we got the Shower of Hope there and people would have showers, like he would just set up and he would cut hair for free. That's where I started getting my hair cut. And it was like something like I saved money and go to the barber or whatever, but it was like, I remember when I was in St. Louis, we had a gorgeous Steinway piano in the church and it had been locked. And I just like unlock this thing. And several times you'd like come in and someone was like concert level playing this piano. And it was someone who was experiencing homelessness who just walked off the street. And it's like, they're like, every human being is amazingly gifted. And when we start treating each other lovingly like human beings, those gifts get unlocked. And it's just the coolest thing.
Yeah, absolutely. John.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I love the notion that recognizing the common humanity of every other person on this planet gets us right where we got to go. But we got a lot of work we can be doing until we get there. I think there's sometimes this, let's just wait for the perfect solution to come along. And there's a whole lot of imperfect actions we can take, and we can do that in community, and we can do that with our best intentions. But, and especially looking at the LA Homeless Services, I will tell you, LAHSA, the LA Homeless Services Authority, has more employees than we have homeless people in my town. So like we are talking scales that are so far apart from each other. Like how do we find some common solutions? And I think that the idea of clearly housing, clearly community, and then recognizing too, though, that communities also have different resources. You know, and I say this as somebody with some recovery experience and with some homelessness experience. Most of the people who are staying in my shelter didn't make any mistakes that were any different than the ones I made as a white middle class kid. I just had a softer landing pad. Or when I totally screwed up and spent, you know, my utility bill money on something I shouldn't have, I had a brother who had an extra $50, or I had a sister who could afford to send me a bus ticket to get me home. Not every family, not every community has that. And so we can't just throw it off and like, well, you got your people, good luck, because your people and my people and somebody else's people, sometimes it's on us, those of us who have additional resources or additional influence, to ensure that that's not so disproportionate.
And, you know, that's a really good point, John. And I just wanted to mention that the Safe Haven program that Mike just talked about, nobody would ever say that sleeping on the ground on church property is the solution we want for people. But that was one thing that a community could do without enough resources and without shelter, without housing, to say, okay, then what can we do? Is it the perfect solution? No. But it was still with a focus on getting people to healing and housing. So I think that's really important too, to remember that sometimes we don't have the resources we need, but there are still things that we can do.
Well, and the great thing of, like, again, about Safe Haven, there are 40,000 faith communities in the state of California. If every faith community said, we're going to do a program like this for 5 people, first of all, that would be 200,000 people who would have a safe place to stay, access to a housing navigator, and more importantly, a community of people who knew their name, who knew their story. They knew people's names. They knew their story. If this, in just a simple program like this, of like, oh, can 5 people stay at my church at night and we'll try to find have a place to live, could transform and humanize homeless services in this country. And really it's been, and again, resistance is a part of the process of change. I've been disappointed. It just sort of shows the work needs to be done. What a hard sell it has been to try to get other communities to do this. And it makes me sad, because it's like, you're missing out. This is where the joy is.
Mm-hmm. And Carol just put in the note, where 7,000 domestic violence survivors turned away from shelters if faith groups opened up their doors. There is so much, and it doesn't even have to be faith groups. It can be other types of groups who say, hey, even if it's one person that they can help. Sean, I'm going to throw out anything that you would like to add.
I think we're closing, right?
Yeah.
So I would just say, end the drug war, create housing, stop worrying about what people are putting into their bodies. The drug and alcohol treatment system, the mental health system, is not going to fix this. It's just not. It's not an appropriate intervention, and oftentimes those systems are harmful systems to people. And that it all goes back to what we're talking about: the solution, the way to heal, the way for all of us to get better, including people who are forced to live outside, is to love people and help them into their greater purpose, their best versions of themselves.
And that isn't, I think we all agree on that, because we've all seen that is transformative, but that isn't to say we don't need people who are experts in certain things, because people have struggles. I mean, whether you're housed or unhoused, you may need to go to someone for help. So I think that that's important to remember. That is a part of it too. But the ultimate is that incredible healing. And just another story. I remember a few years ago taking my board and showing them, taking them on a journey through homelessness. And we would go to shelters in our housing, and we were going to have lunch, and they were like, oh, great, we can serve lunch at the shelter. And we said, no, you're not serving lunch. You're eating lunch with the people in the shelter. You're sitting down, staff will serve. You'll sit down and eat with people. And of course, we asked the people there if that was okay. We wanted to be respectful. But the comments I heard afterward were, they're just like me. So-and-so had a great sense of humor. And we're going, yeah, they're just like you. They just happen to have fallen on hard times for whatever reason, and they're homeless. All right. So we have, it looks like 2 minutes. So in 30 seconds each, do each one of you want to have a final word? John, I'm going to start with you. Put you on the spot.
All right. First of all, it has been an absolute honor to be a part of this today and to hear. I have started off and have been a housing guy and kind of will drill down on housing all the time. And I've gotten really good, valuable reminders on the value of community in that too. And I just wanted to, as a closing thought, just say, hey, listen, if there may be people who you are thinking of in a local community, in a homeless population who might not fit one of the sort of broad brushes we have painted things with, as Mike said, maybe there's not bad people, there's good people who are doing things we wish they wouldn't be doing. But even when we see that happen, that shouldn't invalidate the work or the efforts that we're putting in. The plural of an anecdote is not data. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're wrong. It means that people are people, and there's going to be people in all sorts of different situations. It's on us to adjust what we're doing to find the ways that we can be the best humans to support those other humans.
And I actually think, I don't mean to cut off Mike or Sean, but I think we're at time. But I really want to thank our panelists today for some incredible insight and wisdom from people who've really been there and done it and know really what does work. And thank you to our amazing audience for joining us today. All of these people you can reach out to if you want more information, or me or Carol. This is a huge crisis, but we need to be all working together, again, focusing on love of one another, caring. These are real human beings. These are our neighbors. These are our community members. And we can end homeless if we accept that this is our people and our community. So thank you all again for joining us today. And we hope to see you with our new series in the new year, and appreciate the work that I know all of you do out there on the ground. So thank you.